Commander Zyra Velkath read the message from High Command 3 times, and 3 times it said the same thing, and 3 times she felt the same sharp pull of anger behind her silver eyes. She was the commanding officer of the Eternal Accord, one of the finest diplomatic vessels in the Veth fleet, and she had earned every rank and title through years of discipline, precision, and hard service. She had not earned any of it to share a command bridge with a human. The word sat in her mind like something cold. Human. She was Veth, tall, silver-scaled, with faint blue light running along the ridges of her neck and shoulders whenever she felt strong emotion, which was not often, because she had trained herself long ago not to feel strong emotion in public. The Veth were an old race, one of the oldest in the Galactic Cooperative, and they carried that age like armor, with pride in every movement and precision in every word. Zyra had served the Veth fleet for 22 years, and she had commanded the Eternal Accord for the last 4. This ship was hers, the crew was hers, the mission was hers, and she ran all of it the way she ran everything, which was with no wasted motion and no tolerance for disorder. The message from High Command was polite and clear and completely unacceptable. Effective immediately, a human liaison officer would be assigned to the Eternal Accord as her permanent co-commander, in accordance with the new Galactic Cooperative Interspecies Collaboration Initiative. Zyra pulled up the initiative document, 47 pages of diplomatic language that said, in simple terms, that the cooperative wanted different species working together at the command level of major vessels to build trust and to show the galaxy what cooperation looked like in practice. It was, she had to admit, a reasonable political goal. She just did not want it happening on her ship. Formal objection within the hour. It was a clean, professional document, 3 pages long, citing crew cohesion protocols, command efficiency standards, and mission sensitivity requirements. High Command denied it the next morning. 1 line, no explanation. She filed a second objection. It was denied before the end of the day. She considered a third, and then she stopped herself, because 3 formal objections would begin to look like she was afraid, and Zyra Velkath was not afraid of anything, and certainly not of a human. She had seen humans before. She had interacted with them at diplomatic stations and cooperative summits. They were small and soft and loud, and they lived such short lives that it seemed almost wasteful to invest serious attention in them. A Veth officer in their prime would outlive 3 human generations. They had no psychic resonance. A Veth could feel the emotional frequency of another Veth across a room, a gentle hum of shared awareness that made communication deep and precise. Humans had nothing like that. They communicated entirely through their mouths and their faces, and sometimes their hands. And somehow they considered this sufficient for a civilization. They had no hive memory. The Veth carried the accumulated experience of their ancestors as a quiet background presence, a vast library of lived wisdom. Humans had books and recordings, and the fragile, unreliable memories of their own short individual lives. They were young as a civilization, barely 1,000 years of spaceflight, which made them practically children by galactic standards. And they were emotional and unpredictable and stubbornly, almost aggressively optimistic in ways that the Veth found exhausting to be around. Zyra had nothing against humans as a category. She simply did not see the logic in placing one at the command level of a Veth diplomatic vessel. It was like installing a decorative light fixture in a precision instrument and calling it an upgrade. She told her first officer, Lieutenant Dale, about the assignment, and Dale's bioluminescence flickered with the faint yellow tint of suppressed amusement, which Zyra chose to ignore. Within an hour, the crew knew. The Accord was not a large ship, and news moved fast. And Zyra heard the quiet conversation stop when she walked past groups of crew members, which meant they were talking about it, which meant they had opinions she had not asked for. By evening, Dale informed her, carefully and professionally, that a small betting pool had formed among the lower decks regarding how many days the human would last before requesting a transfer. She did not ask what the most popular answer was. She told Dale to ensure the crew remained professional and respectful at all times. And Dale said, "Yes, Commander," and the faint yellow came back. The Eternal Accord was 3 days into its transit route, between the Veth Dominion border and Sol Station, when the docking signal came in, and Zyra was on the bridge when it did, standing straight, hands behind her back, expression perfectly neutral. The crew was watching, not openly, not obviously, but she could feel it, the slight angle of heads, the attention held behind eyes that were pretending to study screens. A shuttle from Sol Station came alongside and docked in Bay 3. Zyra did not go down to meet it, because co-commanders were not guests who needed collecting. They knew where the bridge was. She waited. After 11 minutes, she noticed the exact time. The bridge doors opened, and Lieutenant Commander Darian Cole of the United Sol Expeditionary Fleet walked in. He was human, which she had expected, and he was not particularly tall, not particularly broad, not particularly striking in any way she could immediately identify. He had dark hair that was slightly longer than regulation, and brown skin, and the kind of quiet, steady eyes that did not blink too much. He wore his uniform cleanly, but not stiffly, and he carried one worn duffel bag over one shoulder, and in his other hand he held a thermos of something that smelled, even from across the bridge, like coffee. He looked around the bridge once, taking in the layout, reading the crew stations, mapping the space behind those calm eyes. And then he found her, and he walked directly to her position, and he stopped at a respectful distance and gave a correct salute. "Lieutenant Commander Darian Cole, Yusef reporting for assignment, Commander," he said. His voice was even and unhurried and not overly formal, like someone who was at ease but paying attention. Zyra looked at him for a moment, the worn bag, the thermos, the quiet eyes, and she returned the salute precisely. "Welcome to the Eternal Accord, Lieutenant Commander," she said, and her voice gave away nothing, because she had trained it carefully not to. "Your quarters are on Deck 3. Dale will show you the layout. Bridge rotation begins tomorrow at 0600. Do not be late." "Understood," he said. And then, because apparently he was that kind of person, he glanced down at the thermos and back up at her, and asked, "Is there somewhere I can get hot water on this ship, or should I just be grateful for what I already have?" There was a very small, very quick flicker of light along the ridges of Zyra's neck, barely visible, and she turned back to her command console before anyone had time to see what color it had been. "Ask Dale," she said. Darian Cole nodded, looked around the bridge one more time with those quiet and steady eyes, and then followed Dale toward the exit. And Zyra watched him go and told herself, firmly, that this was going to be a long and deeply inconvenient assignment. She was right about the first part. She was entirely wrong about the second. The first week was quiet, or at least, it was quiet in the way that a fire is quiet before it catches. Darian Cole did not make a scene. He did not complain. He did not challenge anyone. He did not walk around the ship acting like he deserved more credit than he had earned. He simply appeared every morning at 0600 exactly, took his post at the secondary command station, and worked. Zyra had expected one of two things from him, either open arrogance, the kind of swagger she had heard humans sometimes carried when they believed they were impressive, or visible anxiety, the nervous overperformance of someone trying too hard to belong. What she got instead was neither, and it was, for reasons she could not immediately name, more irritating than either would have been. He was just present, quiet and watchful, and completely attentive to everything around him. On the second day, he asked Dale for a copy of the Veth Bridge Protocol Manual, which was a document of 312 pages, written in formal Veth procedural language, and which most new Veth officers, needed 3 to 4 weeks to learn well enough to perform comfortably at their station. Darien read it over 2 nights and had it operational by day 3. He made no announcement about this. He simply started following the protocols correctly, without being told again, and the crew noticed in that quiet way that crews always notice things they are not expecting. And they said nothing, and they noticed more. On the 4th day, the ship's lead engineer, a compact and humorless Veth named Torvin, had a problem in the lower engineering bay. A plasma relay was misfiring in a pattern that the ship's diagnostic systems could not isolate, and it was beginning to affect the atmospheric processors on Deck 5 in ways that were subtle but getting worse. Torvin was deep in the problem when Darien appeared in the doorway, not because anyone had sent him there, but because he had noticed the small pressure change in the Deck 5 air and followed it to its source to find out why. Torvin looked at him the way one looks at something unexpected in a place where it should not be. But the problem was still unsolved, and an extra set of eyes cost nothing, so he explained the situation. Darien listened without interrupting. He asked 2 questions, and then he looked at the relay housing for a long, still moment, and asked if he could borrow a piece of conductive wire from the repair kit. What followed was 15 minutes of Darien doing something with the wire, and a bent junction fork that made Torvin's secondary eye twitch with professional discomfort. And then the relay stopped misfiring, the atmospheric pressure on Deck 5 normalized, and Darien handed the fork back and said he was sorry for bending it. Torvin stared at the working relay for a moment, and then at the human, and said nothing. Silence was the loudest possible form of respect. pp. The story reached the mess hall by dinner. Zyra heard 3 different versions of it before the end of the day, and none of them were exaggerated, which somehow made it more difficult to dismiss. pp. She watched him at meals, from across the room. He did not sit with the officers. He did not position himself at the center of any conversation. He sat wherever there was space, usually near the lower-ranked crew members, and he learned their names, all of them within the first week, which was something that even Zyra, after 4 years of commanding the ship, could not entirely claim. He was doing it without any visible effort, or perhaps he was working very hard at it and it simply looked effortless. She could not tell, and the fact that she could not tell bothered her in a way she did not appreciate. Then the Keth patrol encounter happened, and everything became considerably less quiet. pp. Accord was crossing the far edge of cooperative claimed space when 3 Keth patrol vessels appeared on the long-range sensors. Keth were not cooperative members, and they had a long and complicated relationship with Veth vessels on their shared border, which in practice meant they sometimes let ships pass without incident, and sometimes decided not to, and there was no reliable method for predicting which response a given day would bring. These 3 decided it would not be a good day for the Accord. They moved into a tight blocking formation, broadcast a challenge signal, and began slowly tightening the angle between themselves and the ship. Zyra ran the tactical calculation immediately. It was clean and by the book, a measured defensive posture with a withdrawal route that would move them out of Keth-claimed range within 40 minutes, at the cost of a course correction and some engine strain, with no confrontation and no escalation. Seconds from giving the order, when Darien spoke from the secondary station, not loudly, not urgently, just clearly. "They are not in attack formation," he said. "They are in a show formation. They want us to flinch." Zyra looked at the sensor data again, and then at him. "Your assessment?" "If we withdraw now, they will follow. It tells them we are worth pushing, but if we hold the course and redirect the diplomatic hail directly to their lead ship, personally, and not through automated protocol, they will have to either respond or escalate. And escalating 3 ships against a Veth diplomatic vessel is more political trouble than we are worth to them." There was a pause on the bridge. 3 seconds in which everyone was very carefully looking at Zyra and pretending not to. She held the course and opened the direct hail herself, because it was her ship and her call, and she spoke to the Keth patrol leader in calm, even tones, acknowledged their concern. naming the Accord and its mission status, and inviting a formal exchange of transit credentials. The Keth lead ship held position for 40 seconds, which was a long 40 seconds, and then it cleared the formation and let them through. Zyra did not look at Darian when it was done. She gave the helm the new heading and said, "Well done, crew," which was about as much praise as she gave to anyone for anything. In the debrief afterward, just the two of them in the small briefing room off the bridge, she told him that his method had been reckless, that it relied on a behavioral assumption about the Keth that could have been entirely wrong. He told her it was not reckless, it was flexible, that all tactics were built on assumptions, and the real skill was knowing which assumptions were likely and which were not. She told him that Veth doctrine existed for a reason. He told her that doctrine was what you used when you had time to think carefully, and instinct was what you used when you did not. And the two needed to understand each other well if they were going to work together. She had no immediate answer to that, so she told him the debrief was over. He nodded, picked up his thermos from the table, and left. And Zyra sat in the empty briefing room a moment longer than she needed to, staring at the door. He had not been wrong, and she knew it, and knowing it did not make her feel better about any of this. That evening, she went to the observation deck alone, the long, curved room at the aft of the ship, where the stars behind them were visible in a wide, unbroken arc. And she stood there with her arms crossed, and her thoughts in an order she did not entirely like. She heard the door open behind her, and she knew without turning that it was him, because his footsteps were lighter than any Veth crew members. She expected him to say something, to ask if she was all right, of his quiet observations, or to pick up the argument from the debrief and press it further. He did none of those things. He walked to a spot a few feet away, sat down on the long curved bench that ran along the window, and drank his coffee in silence, looking out at the stars the same way she was looking at them. She did not tell him to leave. She was not entirely sure why. They stayed like that for several minutes, and the silence between them was not uncomfortable. And that was the most confusing part of the entire day, which had already had several confusing parts. And Zyra stood in the starlight and told herself that she was simply allowing a colleague a shared space, nothing more. She almost believed it. The distress signal arrived on what Darian tracked as a Tuesday. Not that the Eternal Accord kept a human calendar, but he had mentioned once that he counted the days of the week out of habit, and Zyra had found herself, without quite meaning to, knowing which day it was in his system. The signal was old Veth emergency code, the kind used by frontier colonies when they had nothing left but a transmitter and desperation, and it came from Tessavar 4, a small Veth settlement on the far edge of the Dominion's outer reach. Zyra pulled the colony's file while the signal was still playing. 4,200 Veth civilians, mostly families, workers, and a small administrative staff. The colony had been established 12 years ago to mine a compound used in Veth drive systems. It was not a military installation, not a strategic target, not the kind of place that should attract dangerous attention. But someone had noticed it, and that someone was a Keth warlord faction called the Vren Collective, which had been pushing into disputed border territory for months, and had apparently decided that a small, undefended Veth colony made a useful pressure point. They had not attacked. They had done something quieter and considerably worse. They had blockaded the colony completely, cutting every supply line. No food shipments, no medicine, no power cells, no communication beyond the emergency band. And they had been doing it for 11 days by the time the signal reached the Accord. Veth High Command was 22 days out. They would dispatch a response fleet, but 22 days was a very long time, when a colony had already consumed 11 days of stockpiles. Zyra was the ranking officer in range. The decision was hers. She called a command briefing and laid out the situation with full clarity. The Accord was a diplomatic vessel, not a warship, but it had defensive capabilities and a fast response time. Profile: they could reach Tessevar 4 in 14 hours. What they could not do was break a blockade by force, not against a Vren fleet that outnumbered them 7-1. The correct response by Veth Doctrine was a visible presence and a defensive holding posture. Move the Accord into high orbit, broadcast their identity and status, and use the political weight of a cooperative diplomatic vessel to slow the Vren's actions while the fleet came. It was a reasonable plan, it was safe, and it was likely to work. Darien sat at the far end of the table and listened to the full briefing without speaking. His hands were around his thermos, his eyes were on the table in the way they looked when he was thinking hard about something. When Zyra asked for responses, the other officers gave theirs, measured, professional, in agreement with the holding posture plan. Then she looked at Darien. She had started doing that without deciding to, looking at him last, to see if he had something different to say. He did. "What do the people on the ground actually need right now?" he asked. The room was quiet for a moment. It was not a tactical question. It was a different kind of question, and it redirected everything. Zyra answered it honestly. Power, food, medical supplies, and someone to tell them they are not going to die. Darien nodded once. Then the ship holds orbit and does the political work, and a small team goes to the surface and does the human work. One of the senior officers pointed out, carefully, that the colonists were Veth. Darien said he was using the term loosely and asked if anyone had objections to the substance of the plan. No one did, and Zyra approved it, because it was not wrong, and because she had learned over recent weeks that when Darien Cole proposed something, it was usually worth trying. He took a team of 6 to the surface, 2 engineers, 2 medics, a supply specialist, and himself, and they took the smaller shuttle down while the Accord moved into high orbit, and Zyra began the careful, difficult work of diplomatic pressure. She ran a comm feed from the surface on a secondary screen at her command station. She told herself this was standard operational monitoring, which was true, and that it had nothing to do with wanting to see what he was doing, which was considerably less true. The colony was in poor shape. The images on the feed showed tired faces and cold rooms, and the specific kind of stillness that came over people who had been conserving energy in every possible sense for too many days in a row. Darien's team moved the moment they landed. The engineers went directly to the colony's power grid, which had been running on backup cells at reduced capacity for 5 days. Darien went to the colony's administrative center and sat down with the colony head, an elder named Counselor Veth Mara, and simply asked her what the most urgent problem was. The elder told him everything. The backup cells were failing unevenly. The medical bay had 3 critical patients who needed consistent power, and the civilian population was fracturing under the stress of isolation, and the children were frightened and not eating properly. Darien listened to all of it without interrupting, and then he divided the work. And then he went and did his share of it with his own hands. He worked the power grid alongside the engineers, rerouting what remained to prioritize the medical bay and the central heating block. And when the engineers hit a corroded junction they did not have the right tool to address, Darien improvised something from materials in the colony's maintenance storage that Zyra, watching from orbit, could not even identify. And it worked. She watched him move through the colony over the following hours, not directing from a distance, but present and visible and doing things himself. He helped carry supply crates from the shuttle. He talked to the medical staff about exactly what their patients needed, and at one point, he sat down on the floor of the colony's main gathering shelter, where most of the civilians were staying, and he talked to people. He talked to children. Zyra could see it clearly on the feed, him sitting cross-legged on the cold floor with several small Veth children settled around him, telling them something she could not hear. But the children were listening, and some of them were almost smiling. And that was not a small thing when a colony had been cut off and frightened for 11 days. Hours into the operation, Counselor Vethmara opened a direct channel to the Accord. Zyra took it herself. The elder's voice was old and careful and deliberate. "You're human," she said. And Zyra noticed she did not say the human, she said you're human. "He weeps when he thinks no one is watching." The corridor near the medical bay, just for a moment, but he never stops moving. "I want you to know that we see this, Commander, and we are grateful for it." Zyra said the appropriate things to the counselor and closed the channel. And then she sat with those words. A man who wept in private and worked in public, who carried the weight of other people's fear and converted it somehow, quietly, into motion, who had no hive memory, no resonance, no ancient framework to fall back on, just his 2 hands and whatever was inside him that kept him going. 12 hours after the surface team had landed, Zyra transmitted a formal cooperative diplomatic censure to the Vren collective lead ship, backed by 3 separate treaty citations she had spent most of the night compiling. And she informed the Vren commander, in the calm and exact tones she used when she was most serious, that a cooperative response fleet was already en route, that the Vren's current position was logged in 3 separate cooperative databases, and that the political cost of maintaining the blockade now exceeded any possible benefit by a significant margin. The Vren held for 6 hours, and then they withdrew. When Darien came back up to the ship, he was tired in a way that went past the surface. He had a scorch mark on his left sleeve from a power cell that had failed close to him. His hair was worse than usual, and he was carrying his thermos, which was finally empty. He came to the bridge to give his report, standard procedure, and he delivered a clean and accurate account of the surface operation, what had been done, what resources had been used, what the colony's current status was. And then, when the report was done, he looked at her. "How are you doing, Commander?" he asked. Not how did the diplomatic operation perform, not what is the next heading, how are you doing? Zyra looked at him for a moment, and she did not have an answer. Ready? Which almost never happened to her. Well enough, she said finally. He nodded, and he went to clean up and rest, and Zyra turned back to her console and told herself, quietly and firmly, that she was not thinking about an elder's words spoken in a cold shelter, on a colony that almost did not make it. She thought about them for the rest of the day, and she thought about them again that night, lying still in the dark of her quarters, watching the faint light of passing stars move across the ceiling, and she let herself ask, just once and very privately, what kind of creature chose to carry all of that and keep walking anyway? She did not answer the question that night, but she did not stop thinking about it, either. The transit week after Tessavar 4 was the quietest the Eternal Accord had been in a long time, not because nothing was happening, but because the crew had the particular kind of quiet that settles over people who have been through something difficult together and come out the other side. Zyra ran the ship exactly as she always did, precisely, efficiently, without deviation from standard. But something had shifted in the air of the bridge that she could not measure with any instrument she had, and that was itself a source of irritation, because Zyra strongly preferred things she could measure. The crew's relationship with Darien Cole had changed. It had been building gradually since the plasma relay and the Keth patrol, but Tessavar 4 had settled it into something permanent. The lower decks had stopped placing bets on when he would request a transfer, which she knew because Dale told her with the careful, neutral expression of someone who had chosen every word deliberately. Zyra did not comment on this. She observed it, filed it somewhere she was not currently examining, and kept working. Then the HoloNet briefing came in from High Command, scheduled as a routine review of the Interspecies Liaison Program's progress. Zyra prepared for it professionally, assembled her data, and invited Darien to attend, because that was the correct protocol. The briefing began well enough. Mission statistics, efficiency metrics, and the Tessavar 4 incident report, which read cleanly and positively from every angle. And then Admiral Vel Soren, one of the senior members of High Command, and a Veth of the conservative faction, made a suggestion. He framed it carefully, the way experienced politicians framed things they suspected might create resistance. He spoke about the symbolic importance of the program, the need to demonstrate not just professional cooperation, but genuine mutual respect between species, could see and understand. And he proposed that as a visible demonstration of that respect, a formal Veth resonance compatibility assessment be conducted between Commander Velkath and Lieutenant Commander Cole. The suggestion landed on the room like something dropped from a very high place. Resonance pairing was not a small thing in Veth culture. It was one of the most significant practices a Veth could participate in. A deep assessment of harmonic compatibility between two individuals that formed the foundation of the most important partnerships in Veth life. Professional, personal, and everything in between. To conduct one between a Veth and a human was, from a purely biological standpoint, expected to produce nothing at all, because humans had no resonance frequency that Veth instruments were designed to detect. But the Admiral was not proposing it for biological reasons. He was proposing it as a symbol, and somehow that made it worse. Cleanly, immediately, and with exactly enough force to make her position unmistakable without becoming unprofessional. She cited biological incompatibility, mission irrelevance, and cultural impropriety, and she requested that the suggestion be removed from the review record. The Admiral accepted her refusal with the smooth grace of someone who had expected it. The briefing continued through its remaining points and closed. The HoloNet connection ended. Zyra stood in the briefing room after everyone else had filed out. Everyone except Darian, who was still at the far end of the table, and who had been completely silent through the entire meeting. She looked at him. "You have nothing to say?" He looked back at her evenly. "It was not my place to say anything in there." "Do you have something to say now?" He thought about it for a moment. "Not if you don't want me to." "I am asking you." He set his thermos down on the table and looked at it rather than at her. "I am not certain what I was supposed to feel about that. Offended, maybe, but I am not sure that is the right reaction. It seemed more like a political move than a real insult, and I did not understand enough about what the ceremony actually meant to know how I should feel about it being rejected so quickly." Zyra was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "It is one of the most important ceremonies of Veth culture. It is used to assess the deep compatibility between two individuals. The results shape some of the most significant relationships in Veth society. And I would not register on it," he said. It was not a question, just a plain statement, said without any self-pity. "No," she said, and the word came out slightly more sharply than she had intended. He nodded slowly, and then he said quietly, "Then I will go read about it, so I at least understand what I apparently cannot participate in." Herself. The conversation was done. She found him 2 hours later in the small crew library at the end of Deck 2. He was sitting alone at one of the reading terminals, and on the screen was the Veth Cultural Archive entry on resonance pairing. It was a long entry, deeply detailed, and he was reading it with the same complete attention he brought to everything, which was unhurried and careful, and treating every word like it deserved to be taken seriously. She stood in the doorway for a moment, before he noticed her. She watched him read, and she felt something move in her chest that she did not immediately have a word for. He looked up and saw her, and his expression did not shift or perform anything, which was somehow more honest than if it had. "I wanted to understand it properly," he said, "not because of what happened in the meeting, because it is important to your people, and things that are important deserve to be understood carefully." Into the room. She did not sit. She stood near the terminal and looked at the screen, at the words of her own culture displayed in the quiet light of a human's reading terminal. "You spend a great deal of time understanding things that do not belong to you," she said. "I spend time understanding things I am around," he said. "That is just the same statement, phrased differently." She looked at him then, really looked at him, the way she had been carefully not doing for several weeks, and she said, in a voice she kept very level, "I no longer think of you the way I did when you arrived on this ship." He waited. He did not prompt her or fill the space with words. He just waited. "I am not certain how I think of you now," she said. "That is not a situation I am accustomed to being in." He was quiet for a moment, and then he asked, "Can I tell you something that may not translate well?" "You may try." "Humans have this idea. There is no single clean word for it in any language I know. It is the idea of the person who shows up, the one who does not wait until they feel ready or worthy or certain, but just goes where they are needed and does what they can with what they have. I have never been the strongest or the most qualified person in any room I have ever been in, but I try every time to be that person, the one who shows up." Zyra did not respond immediately. She turned the words over in her mind, feeling their shape, testing their weight, and she thought about a man sitting on the cold floor of a colony shelter with frightened children, still moving, still present, still showing up. "That is a meaningful thing," she said, quietly, and she meant it completely. He looked at her for a moment, and then he nodded, and went back to reading, and did not press further, and did not ask her to say more, because he never pushed, and she was beginning to understand that this was not passivity. It was a particular kind of respect. She left the library. She walked through 2 corridors and down 1 level, moving deliberately and without hurrying, until she reached the resonance calibration chamber on Deck 4. A small and technical room normally used for standard crew compatibility assessments, and she sat down alone at the console and looked at the controls for a long moment before she touched them. She entered a set of parameters, not her own, his. She used everything she knew about him, the way he moved through difficulty, the quality of his attention, the emotional patterns she had observed over weeks of close proximity, the particular frequency of his steadiness. She built a resonance profile from pure observation rather than biology, which was not what the technology had been designed to do, but which was the only kind of profile a human could ever provide. She ran the calibration, very still, for a long time, and looked at what came back. The light along the ridges of her neck shifted, slowly, quietly, to a color she had not shown in a very long time. And she did not name it immediately, not even to herself, because some things needed to be held carefully for a while before they could be spoken. But she did not close the screen, and she did not leave the room for a long time after that. The summons from Velkath Prime came on the 14th day of the transit week, formal, official, sealed with the mark of the High Council. Commander Velkath was required to appear in person before the full council to deliver her report on the Tessevar 4 crisis and provide her assessment of the interspecies liaison program's future. She read it once and understood immediately what it was. It was not simply a report request. The conservative faction of the High Council had been building pressure against the Cooperation Initiative since before it had launched, and Tessevar 4, despite being a success, had given them material to work with. The improvised tactics, the unorthodox surface operation, a human's methods that appeared nowhere in any Veth doctrine manual. These things could be framed, carefully and dishonestly, as evidence of instability rather than effectiveness. Zyra prepared her official report and said nothing to Darien beyond the fact that she had been summoned to Velkath Prime. She told him the Accord would be in his command during her absence, which was not a small thing to say, and she said it without ceremony. He received it the same way. He nodded and asked how long she expected to be gone. She told him she was not certain. It would depend on how long the council chose to deliberate. He nodded again, and she left. The council chamber on Velkath Prime was exactly as she remembered it. A vast circular room of cold, pale stone, with the council members seated in the elevated arc of the upper tier, and the speaking position at the center below, lit from above by thin, precise beams of light that had been designed to make whoever stood in them feel very small and very visible. There were 14 council members, 7 aligned with the Reform faction, 6 aligned with the Conservative faction, and 1, Elder Counselor Keth Varen, who was considered undecided, which made her the most important person in the room. The Conservative faction's lead speaker, Counselor Ren Sova, began. She was precise and polite and completely unyielding. She walked through the record of the Interspecies Liaison Program with the particular skill of someone who had decided what conclusion they wanted before they examined any evidence. She cited the plasma relay incident as an unauthorized modification to Veth engineering systems. She cited the Keth patrol encounter as an unapproved departure from established tactical doctrine. She cited the Tessavar 4 surface operation as a human officer operating outside his designated command role without formal sanction. Every item on her list was technically accurate, and every item had been made to sound like a failure when it had in fact been the exact opposite. And Zyra stood at the center of that cold stone room and listened to all of it, with her hands behind her back and her expression perfectly controlled. Turn to speak arrived. She did not use her prepared report. She had it with her, a clean, documented, data-rich summary of everything that had occurred, and she set it aside on the speaker's console, because data was not what this room needed, and she knew it. She looked up at 14 faces watching her from the elevated arc, and she spoke. She told them about a man who read 312 pages of Veth protocol in 2 nights, and asked nothing in return for it. She told them about a plasma relay restored with a bent fork, and a kind of knowledge that did not come from any training manual any Veth institution had written. She told them about a Keth patrol that had chosen not to escalate because a human had understood, without any doctrine to guide him, what they were actually threatening and what they were actually afraid of. She told them about Tessavar 4, not the tactical summary, but what she had watched with her own eyes. And frightened planet with 6 people and a plan that looked like no plan any Veth officer had been trained to recognize. And building warmth and power and something harder to measure from broken parts and sheer personal determination. She told them what the counselor on the surface had said, that he wept alone and worked in public. And she told the council what she believed that meant. Humans have no hive memory, she said, and her voice carried clearly across the stone chamber. They have no psychic resonance, no biological advantage, no ancient architecture of accumulated wisdom to draw from. They have one life, short by our standards, and they know it. Every single one of them knows it. And the question I have been asking myself since the Eternal Accord left Sol Station with one of them on board is this. What kind of creature, knowing that it is fragile and finite and largely alone in the universe, keeps walking into the dark anyway? Species buries its dead and then goes back to work. And the answer, Council, is not a weak one. It is the answer of a species that has decided, somewhere deep in its character, that what it does with the time it has matters more than how much time it has. And I have watched one of them prove that, up close, over many weeks, and I am no longer willing to pretend that what I witnessed was anything less than remarkable. The chamber was quiet when she finished, the kind of quiet that meant something had landed and was still being felt. The vote was held, 7 for continuation, 6 against. Elder Counselor Keth Varen sat with the question for a long moment that stretched until the air in the room felt tight, and then she voted for continuation. The program would go forward. Zyra walked out of the council chamber and through the tall entrance corridor and out into the pale Velkath afternoon. The sky here was always a deep purple gray, and the air smelled of cold stone and the faint mineral scent of the ancient city, and she stood at the top of the broad steps that led down to the public plaza below, and she stopped. He was at the bottom of the steps. Darian Cole, in his Yusef uniform, soaked through from the rain that had apparently been falling for a considerable amount of time, standing at the base of the council building on a planet he had never visited before. He was holding 2 cups in his hands, one in each, and his hair was completely flat and dark with water, and his shoulders were soaked through, and he looked, somehow, entirely unbothered by all of this. She stared at him. He looked up and saw her at the top of the steps, and lifted one of the cups very slightly in greeting. She walked down the steps slowly, and when she reached the bottom, she stood in front of him and looked at his face, and at the rain on his uniform, and at the 2 cups. "You were not permitted to attend the hearing," she said. "I know," he said. "You have been standing here the entire time?" "I did not know how long it would take," he said, "so I decided not to leave." She looked at him, at this wet and patient and quietly stubborn human who had traveled to a planet he had never been to, and stood in the rain for an unknown number of hours in front of a building he could not enter, simply because he had made a decision not to go away. She thought about a resonance scan and a color she had not yet named out loud. She thought about an elder's voice saying, "You're human," and meaning it. She thought about a man on a cold floor telling stories to frighten children, and a man who wept in empty corridors and worked everywhere else. She reached out and took one of the cups. It was tea, that style, slightly wrong in the blend, but close enough that someone had clearly tried. And she stood beside him in the rain, without asking him to move to shelter, without saying anything at all, for a moment. The rain fell evenly around them, and the city was quiet in the late afternoon, and the eternal accord was somewhere above them in orbit, waiting. "I have reconsidered my initial assessment of your assignment," she said, finally. He turned to look at her, and there was something in his eyes that was quiet and warm and completely present, paying full attention the way he always did to everything. "What is your new assessment?" She looked straight ahead at the gray plaza, and the rain falling into it in slow, steady lines, and the light along the ridges of her neck shifted, soft and steady, into a color the universal translator had no entry for, because there was no equivalent word in any language that had yet been catalogued. "Satisfactory," she said, pending continued observation. He was quiet for just a moment, and then he smiled, small and real, just at the corner of his mouth. The rain in the same direction she was looking, and he did not make a bigger thing of it than it was, because he never did. "I will take it," he said. And they stood there together, in the rain, on the planet at the edge of the known galaxy, with 2 cups of almost right tea, and for the first time since the Eternal Accord had received a docking signal, carrying one worn duffel bag and a thermos of coffee. Zyra Velkoth did not feel the need to be anywhere other than exactly where she was, and she did not feel the need to examine why.